Well, thanks for joining me this morning. Hope that my lesson edifies you. Bow with me, please. Father, as always, we are so grateful to read your word so that it will edify and strengthen us. Help our faith to grow so that we might serve you and trust you day in and day out. It is through Jesus that we come to your throne of grace and mercy. Amen. Back in March of 1959, in the Peanuts comic strip, Linus appears, and he's building a sandcastle. He works on it for hours, and it goes through and takes you scene by scene as he builds it. And then, once he's finished, he stands back and admires it, when all of a sudden this storm comes up and blows over the sandcastle. And now he's standing there where his beautiful masterpiece once was, and it's all leveled sand. And he says to himself, I know that there's a lesson in this, but I'm not sure what it is. I think that that's really what we should come away with our text this morning. We're going to be looking at Jesus walking on the water, John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. Matthew and Mark tell this same story, but they emphasize a little bit different details. In fact, Matthew has Peter actually coming out on the water to walk with Jesus. And we have a tendency, I think, sometimes, and especially preachers I've noticed, and I've been guilty of this in the past, to try to mix the different accounts. And what happens is that we end up not realizing that we're not telling the account through the eyes of the one who's writing about it, that they have something different to tell us. And so if we mix the accounts, we kind of miss the particular point that each author has to make. John, as I've said, and I'm doing a series now on the signs that John recorded, because in the back of his book he says he's guided by this purpose, that he's written these signs that we might come to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing in his name we might have life. You see, John is writing because we can't be there to actually see like he did. And so John is writing so that we might come to know through his testimony and the testimony of others exactly what it is that Jesus did, so that we can be guided from death to life. Now, I want to tell you the story about this particular scene. The context, to remind you, is in John chapter 6. Jesus has come from Jerusalem to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. There's a large crowd that's followed him, and he's performing signs by healing the sick, and everybody is following him because of that. And so, that kind of shows us that John knows that when he writes about the signs, it helps people to believe in Jesus. He sits down with his disciples on the mountain, and it's during the time of Passover, and this is when, of course, he feeds the 5,000 men plus the women and children. It's possible that there are upwards of 20,000 people that in this miracle. And of course, they don't have enough in terms of actual resources or money to be able to feed these people. And so Jesus is not hindered by this, but he's able to do it. And that demonstrates, of course, that he is the bread that came down out of heaven. And that's been kind of the focus of these signs, is the fact that heaven came down and in order to guide us and help us out of death and into light. Now, after the feeding of the 5,000 men plus the women and children, they gathered up 12 baskets. It's possible that each apostle, each of the 12, got a basket, and so they're getting firsthand witness here of the miracle of Jesus by gathering up all the fragments from these 5 loaves and 2 fish. And of course, the people correctly see that Jesus is the prophet that Moses had predicted would come, but they want to take and make him king by force. And so he withdraws in order to prevent them from doing that. And this is kind of on the order of what he says to his mother back in chapter 2, when she comes and says they have no wine at the wedding. And Jesus says, "Woman, my hour is not yet come." What does this have to do with me? And so Jesus knows his hour is not yet, and so he goes and sort of hides himself. Now, here's what we read in John chapter 6, beginning verse 16. "Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, and after getting into a boat, they started to cross the sea to Capernaum. It had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea began to be stirred up because of a strong wind was blowing. Then when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, 'It is I, do not be afraid.' So they were willing to receive him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going." Now, when you read through this, I want you to notice that John does not emphasize the fear the disciples might have of the storm. In other scenes, the disciples are afraid and they say, "Master, we're perishing." But John doesn't emphasize that. He also doesn't emphasize their efforts in rowing against the storm. Now, he does say that they're rowing and they're out in the middle of the lake, but John doesn't emphasize that. And he also doesn't emphasize the fact that in the other accounts, Jesus actually stills the storm, or the wind stops when he gets in the boat. All John does is tell us that the boat gets to the other side. So here's what we've got going on. Jesus has gone into the mountain by himself. He's alone. The disciples go down to the sea. And they get into the boat and they start crossing over to Capernaum. Now remember, Peter and Andrew, James and John, they're experienced fishermen. They kind of know what they're doing. In fact, as I was thinking about that for this lesson, I wonder if in the other accounts where there's the storm and Jesus is asleep in the stern and they say, "Master, we're perishing," I wonder if that's more the other the eight rather than just the 4 of them. Maybe they're hard at work and maybe they're struggling, but I wonder if the 8 are somewhat a little nervous about, well, maybe a lot nervous about what's going on. Pat and I got to spend a little time with Glenn and Phyllis Schliebner out on their boat the other day. It's been a long time since I've been out on a boat. And Glenn's taking us out. We're headed from Lake Dora through one canal, and then another, and then to Lake Eustis, and then to another canal, and then to a restaurant. And when we get out on Lake Eustis, it's a little choppy, which it wasn't on Lake Dora. So I have to admit, in spite of the fact that I knew Glenn, knew what he was doing, and Glenn didn't seem worried about it, it felt a little unnerving to me. And Glenn assured us that the boat's not going to tip over, because he probably kind of felt my fear. But you see, John doesn't emphasize the fear of any of the disciples in this particular passage. He is emphasizing, though, that they're out in the middle of the lake. And let me remind you a little bit about the Sea of Galilee, the lake, or the Lake of Galilee. It's the lowest freshwater lake in all of the world. It's about 700 feet below sea level. So it's that way. Now it's the second lowest lake in the world, because the Dead Sea, which is not considered a freshwater lake, is even lower. The Sea of Galilee is about 13 miles long and about 8 miles wide. And it's about 140 feet deep. And I think I read that the average depth is about 57 feet. For those of you who live here in Central Florida, it's somewhat equivalent to Lake George. Lake George up near Ocala is about 11 miles long and about 6 miles wide. The main difference, though, is that Lake George is only about 8 feet deep in terms of its average depth. So the disciples are out there. They went out by themselves, according to John. Jesus didn't send them out. They just went out there. We don't know whose boat it was, and they're starting towards Capernaum. Capernaum is sort of the area where Jesus tends to have his focus for his headquarters while he's in his ministry in Galilee. But John does emphasize that it's dark. And he does emphasize that the sea is being stirred by the really strong wind, and that they're out in the middle of the lake, which of course, you can surmise that it would get kind of tough out there. But John's not really emphasizing that. But anyway, while they're out there, Jesus is walking on the water towards the boat. And when they see Jesus, that's when they become afraid. And I find that fascinating. They're not afraid about the water. They're not afraid about the wind. They're afraid in seeing Jesus. Now, the other Gospels tell us that they think they're seeing a ghost. John doesn't bring that up, so we're not going to emphasize that here as well. But they're afraid when they see Jesus, and they haven't seen him. And of course, what a sight that would be. Here he is walking on the water. I mean, they've seen him do some fantastic miracles. They've watched him turn water into wine. They've watched him heal a man's son from a distance. They watched him they watched him heal a man who's been paralyzed or lame for 38 years. They've watched him feed 5,000 men plus the women and children. They've watched him, even though John doesn't mention specifically, watched him healing other people that are sick. John just sort of says that as a summary. We know it in between the turning water into the wine and when Jesus goes down and John records the cleansing of the temple where Jesus kicks all the money changers out, that he says that he's performing signs down there. So the disciples have been watching him do various miracles up to this point, demonstrating his great power. But this is not something that they've seen, and so it must have been quite a sight to watch Jesus walking on the water. That's not something that they anticipated. But Jesus assures them that they, not to be afraid. And actually what the text says, I am, do not be afraid. Now that's kind of important in John. John uses this phrase because John is trying to connect it. He actually uses it about 23 times. He uses this little phrase, I am, and he connects it, he's connecting it with Exodus chapter 3, where Moses says, who shall I say, send me? And we know later on he's called Yahweh or Jehovah, and he says, you tell them that I am sent you. And so John, even though he's writing in Greek, is trying to connect it with that. And he does it in a couple of ways, in two ways. One, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. And so John uses these concrete images to help us to see Jesus as Jehovah, as Yahweh, or part of that. And he also uses the I am without any qualification. In John chapter 8, Jesus says to the crowd, before Abraham was born, I am. And so John is trying to help us to see that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so the I am, Yahweh actually became flesh. And we beheld, well, John said we beheld his glory, and now we get to see his glory by reading what John writes to us. But anyway, it says that Jesus assures them, I am, do not be afraid. And then it says they gladly received him, or immediately, or they were willing to receive him into the boat, and immediately they were at the land, or the side where they were going. They were at their destiny. So once this is finished, of course, then Jesus spends a lot of time trying to explain to the crowds what the feeding of the 5,000 men and women and children meant, that he is the bread that has come down out of heaven. I mean, he literally is. And of course, Jesus oftentimes uses a very concrete image in order to teach a spiritual truth, and the people most of the time, of course, don't get it. But here we have what's really more of a private kind of miracle, where just the disciples get to see him. And I think that here Jesus is strengthening the faith of the disciples, as well as he, of course, no doubt, is strengthening us. But let me remind you again, John isn't emphasizing the fear of the disciples. And so this isn't about Jesus calming the storms of our life. And he's not, of course, talking about the efforts of the disciples to row against the storm and not making any progress. So this isn't about grace and so forth. And this isn't about Jesus stilling the storm. I think what's happening here, first of all, is that John's trying to emphasize the spiritual condition of the world. As John writes, he says that they get in the boat, it had already become dark as they're going out. Darkness is really important in John because Jesus is the light which is coming into the world, and it is trying to shine into the dark places in order to bring people out of the darkness and into the light. In chapter 1, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. And then later on in chapter 3, verse 19, this is the judgment that is coming, that the light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. So I think here's sort of a, if you will, sort of a symbolic sense, without taking away from the reality of what's really going on, where the disciples are rowing out into darkness, and that's the condition of this world. It is what we live in, and sometimes the darkness tries to envelop us and keep us from the light. But Jesus is the light who comes into the world in order to shine and to help us come out of the world. Now the sea is also being stirred here because of the strong wind. Oftentimes, if as you read through the Old Testament in particular, you will find that the sea and its stirring with the winds and so forth, it can be very chaotic, and that sort of represents the condition of the world. In Jonah, chapter 2, when he's swallowed by the big fish, he says in his poem, "I called out of my distress to the Lord, and he answered me. I cried for help from the depth of Sheol." Even though he's in the fish in the deep, he calls it Sheol. "You heard my voice, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the current engulfed me, and all your breakers and billows passed over me. So I said, I have been expelled from your sight. Nevertheless, I will look again toward your holy temple. Water encompassed me to the point of death. The great deep engulfed me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. I descended to the roots of the mountains. The earth with its bars was around me forever. But you have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. While I was fainting away, I remember the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple." So you see, with Jonah, there's this idea that the sea represents death, and he's been cast into it, but God saves him, and he comes out of it. And so you see John with two very simple images here: the chaos of the sea and the darkness. Sort of, I think, gives us sort of a hint that this is what the world is like, and that's really what he's been trying to show through his gospel, that the world is in darkness. But you'll notice, though, what else John emphasizes, and that is that they were willing to receive him into the boat. So they see Jesus and they invite him into the boat. And in fact, that's what John writes about in the beginning. He says in chapter 1 and verse 12, "But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become the children of God, even to those who believe in his name." So John is emphasizing here that the disciples who've been watching these signs by Jesus, these miracles, and seeing who he is, they've been growing in their faith, and they reach out to him in the midst of this spiritual dark world, this chaotic world, this world where we die that is full of death, and invite Jesus into the boat with them. John also writes back in chapter 1, beginning in verse 9, "There was the true light which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. So you see, John is trying to emphasize that Jesus was rejected. He's the light coming in here, shining in the darkness, and even those who were of his own countrymen, rejected him because they wanted to stay in darkness. They wanted to stay. But here are his disciples, these simple fishermen and tax collector and zealot and men who were not educated, men who were not the elite of society. Their simple faith invites Jesus into the boat. They were willing to receive him. And so I think here John again is helping us to see that the signs that he's writing about help us to see who Jesus is, so that we might accept him and we might receive him as well. But John wants us, I think, to see the reason for receiving Jesus. And again, that's the simple thing, the simple assurance that Jesus gives to them. My translation is, "It is I, do not be afraid." But some think that we should say, "I am, do not be afraid." And so Jesus is again reminding us of what John writes earlier. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so here is God actually coming down from heaven to our world. God coming down so that we might have the benefits of that. And so John is showing us the reason for receiving Jesus, not just because he's a good teacher, not because he's a miracle worker, not because he feeds people, not because he can do things that can't be explained. It's because he is actually God in the flesh. He is actually the I Am who has come down to guide us out of this dark world. So John writes that we might know who Jesus is. And he did so that we might believe in him. Now, to those people out there who don't know Jesus, and if you're watching this, we want you to know about Jesus. We want you to know about the miracles he did. We want you to know about why he came in this world. Heaven came down in the form of Jesus in order to do signs so that we might come to believe that he is the Messiah, the anointed one, the one sent by the Father into this world to perform these miracles so that he might demonstrate that he is indeed that sent one, that Messiah, and that he is the Son of God. He's no mere human being. He looks human, but he's beyond that. He is God in the flesh. And so John writes so that we might come to believe that. And if you don't believe that, you need to recognize just what John is writing about, so that you can help believe. So that you can come to faith and you can come to a greater understanding. And I hope that you will do that. But for those of us who already believe in Jesus, this helps to strengthen our faith. This helps us to understand what Jesus is all about. And I think the Gospel of John shows that we're intended to grow by those signs. Nicodemus in chapter 3 comes to Jesus in the dark of night and says, we know that you're a teacher. We know that you're sent from God because of the signs you do. But he's there in darkness. Then later on, he speaks in front of everybody on behalf of Jesus. And then at the end, he helps Joseph bury the body of Jesus in full loyalty. And so he grows as a result of that because of the signs that he was doing. And that's why John then does and writes about the signs that he does. And that's why Jesus walked on the water, so that we might come to believe that he is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. There were these two preachers that normally went fishing together quite a lot. They had a cabin up on a lake, and one time they invited another fellow preacher with them, and the three of them are out there and they're fishing. And one of the two that was a regular up there, he all of a sudden stands up and says, I gotta run to the restroom. And so he hops off the boat and seemingly skims right across on the water without sinking. Goes into the cabin and comes back same way. And of course the preacher who was invited, he's back there, he's wondering what's going on. And then the other preacher, all of a sudden, he says, I got to go to the restroom too. And so he jumps up and he hops off the boat and he right across the water without sinking into the cabin. and then comes back, same way. And so that third preacher's there, and so all of a sudden he jumps up and says, I got to go to the bathroom. So he hops in the water, boom, sinks right away. And then he starts swimming, gets to the shore, goes into the cabin, and then comes out. And again, he jumps into the water, anticipating that he's going to do the same thing, but he just sinks and he swims back. Now, as he's swimming back, one of the preachers says to the other, do you think we should tell him where the rocks are? And the other one says, nope. Jesus walked on the water, but he didn't do it with rocks. He did it because he's God in the flesh. And what he wants us to do is to see his glory, that he comes and becomes a part of our world and dwells among us, so that we might come to dwell with him and we might receive all of the benefits that heaven has to offer us. So heaven came down and glory fills our souls when we see the signs that Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, did for us. Thank you, and God bless.